Good evening, everybody, and welcome to JWA's sort of post quarantine book talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Very happy to be back with you tonight for the last session of our summer series. If you're new to JWA and our quarantine book talks, very happy to have you with us. If you've been with us for months, welcome back. Also happy to have you. Please introduce yourselves in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone so everybody can see. Also add your questions in the chat during our conversation and I'll be sure to bring them in. We're really delighted to be able to continue offering this program and growing the JWA community, and we're grateful to the partnership of Jewish Live. Before I introduce our featured author for this evening and begin our conversations, I want to say just a few words about JWA for those who may not be aware of all of our work. We are a digital archive that expands the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We take an intersectional approach to Jewish history and culture because we believe that uncovering the diversity of our stories helps us understand the world we live in and create a better one. The quarantine book talks are just one aspect of our work, and I hope you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we have. I am delighted to welcome tonight's speaker. Rachel Sharona Lewis is, as she calls herself, an accidental mystery novelist based here in Massachusetts in Watertown. By day, she organizes faith communities in the Boston area around local social justice efforts with Boston's Jewish Community Relations Council. And The Rabbi Who Prayed with Fire, our book for this evening, is her debut novel. Welcome, Rachel. So glad to have you here.
So good to be here.
So tell us about this identity as accidental mystery novelist. How does one become an accidental mystery novelist? How did you find yourself writing this book?
Sure. So I have been someone who has written off and on in my life. I wrote some pretty angsty poetry as a teen, and I kept some travel blogs when I was traveling around the world at different points. But fiction was never really my cup of tea. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I was walking around a beach town in Massachusetts, Rockport, Massachusetts, and my wife and I stumbled upon a library sale. And we started looking at all of these boxes of old books that this library was selling. And somehow my eyes just went right away to this set of mystery novels. The Rabbi Who, Friday the Rabbi slept late, Saturday the Rabbi did this, Sunday the Rabbi did that. The Rabbi David Small series that was written by Harry Kemmelman, that in the 60s and 70s and 80s were bestsellers, and really became this set of books that a lot of people had really looked to, both to like see their own community, but also a lot of non-Jews had read these books. And I didn't know any of this at the time. I just really caught on to the word rabbi in these book titles. And I started reading the first one right there at this book sale and was just totally hooked. Rabbi David Small, right off the bat in these books, is just so unabashedly like Jewish and using Talmudic reasoning to deal with conflicts with his congregants and solve mysteries and murders. And there was something about using the genre of mystery that really like brought me in. But what really like sold me was that it was clear that Kemmelman was using the genre to really just comment on the contemporary American Jewish community in his time. He really wrote a lot about assimilation, about how the rabbi shouldn't just be, the Jew that no one else has the time and commitment to be. He, in between all of the mysteries and the sermons, gave some commentary on the feminist movement and on the civil rights movement, and how he thought that this community, this shul in a town called Barnard's Crossing, Massachusetts, should or should not be engaged in these parts of the contemporary milieu. And I was reading these books and I was like, someone should write an updated version of this, because it's a time of real like change and tumult and innovation in our own Jewish community. And it would be really interesting to see it through this lens, and also in the context of mysteries. And I started to just get these visions of Rabbi Vivian Green, a younger female queer rabbi who would be sort of in her own context dealing with some of her own both mysteries, but also the challenges of what it is to be, a modern Jewish leader in these days. And so I started writing. I also, at the time, as you mentioned, I worked for the Jewish Community Relations Council here in the greater Boston area, was spending most of my days as an organizer working with people in immigration detention. And it was a very intense time. And just to have this outlet of imagination, of writing, became something that I really held dear and was really nourishing to me in this time. And so just thinking about writing as a healing practice and as a practice of imagination was so helpful to me. I didn't even start off thinking this would be a book. I really just wanted to write and saw this real lovely invitation from 60 years ago from Harry Kemmelman to do that.
I love that. I love how I feel like for so many creative people, there's so many accidents that lead to imagination and creativity, right? Like you can set out to do certain things in the world, but other things just kind of happen that change your path or that give you new avenues for expression and for kind of action in the world, which is always exciting to know that those possibilities are out there and not know exactly what they are. Were you a mystery reader before? I mean, I know you hadn't known this particular series, but was the genre something that you had explored?
No, I hadn't. There was something so familiar about these particular books just in the culture that I was watching and paying attention to. And so it was such a surprise. It was such an accident. And I also just feel like it was a real invitation to explore fiction in a new way. And I feel like, we all live lives where there are so many different pieces of ourselves and we're dealing with so many things. And writing this book was a way for me to really process a lot of different dynamics that were going on in my own life and my work in our country. And so I really feel like fiction writing is something that a lot of us are probably very capable of, and thinking about how stories can really push us forward in some of our own thinking is just something that I've learned a lot about in the past few years, and that just happened to take the form of a mystery.
So tell us a little bit about how you said sort of Rabbi Vivian kind of came to you in some ways. So I'd love to hear more about how you developed her character. I mean, as someone who studies Jewish women's history and the impact of feminism on the Jewish community, it's like, well, of course, right? If you're going to update this story of who the rabbinic leader is, who's going to ask the tough questions or make the connections, it makes sense that it would be a woman. But I'm curious sort of how you decided to choose this young woman, a queer person, and what that allowed you to do, sort of what we can learn through the eyes of Rabbi Vivian that we wouldn't through maybe a more traditional rabbinic figure.
Yeah, I've seen in the chat that a few people are familiar with the original Rabbi Small books. And if you remember, the toolbox that he really used in solving these mysteries was Pilpul, was this Talmudic argumentation and logic. He teaches it to the police chief of the town, who ends up reoccurring and talking about Pilpul in this funny reoccurring scene. And he was really this kind of curmudgeonly loner who was wanting his community to really devote themselves more to Torah and davening, and they just never really got there, and he was never really fully content with them. And I was thinking about when I was imagining Rabbi Vivian, what would her toolbox be? How would she be thinking about her role in her community, and when she was faced with challenges, who would she call upon? And so for me, I am someone who is around a lot of rabbis, both socially, familially, work-wise. And I've just seen so many amazing female rabbis, queer rabbis, all kinds of rabbis, really reach out and build relationships in really strong ways with people in their community, with people in the town or the city that they're in, and that those relationships become a really key part of how they solve challenges as they come up. And so for me, I felt like I wanted to reclaim a rabbinic figure who would really be reliant on friends, on congregants, on a team that could really solve challenges together. I also think that that Rabbi Vivian is irreverent at times and a little snarky and like questions authority, which I think in a lot of ways is, reflective of what younger women who are put into these sort of like contexts where power is being wielded, something that often happens with them. And I think for me, it's sort of a subtle sort of homage to her queerness too, because I think, I myself am queer, and I think just having like moved through a world, and thankfully it's like more accepting now than it was, but you just have to deal with, sort of messing with people's expectations and getting stupid questions and like being judged or talked down to or whatever it is. And so I just wanted the focal point of this story and of this sort of mystery to be someone who had this toolbox of relationship building, irreverence, risk taking, asking questions. And I also really loved the idea, as someone who like has spent a lot of time with rabbis, of really showing a character who was a full person, who had friends, who like cursed sometimes, who dated, who was just a person making their way through the world, who had this particular role. And so if it's okay, I'd love to read an excerpt from the book that I think really speaks to that. This is chapter 12. I don't think it's a huge spoiler, but there is a romance in this book. And this is Vivian spending some time with her clergy pastor friend, and Heather, the friend, really trying to encourage her in her dating life. So this is chapter 12 of The Rabbi Who Prayed with Fire. I saw Carla today, Vivian told Reverend Heather Wu as they stood in the popcorn line. They were about to see a raunchy comedy with a full female cast in a theater a few towns over, where they were less likely to run into congregants. Carla, the hottie from the mayor's forum. That's right, Vivian said, wincing at Heather's description. What happened? Heather asked. We were in a bookstore. Heather chuckled, typical. Unfazed by Heather's mocking, Vivian continued. I went over to her and struck up a conversation. There was some flirtatious banter. I did that thing where I nervously start to give a sermon about my foundational beliefs about Judaism. Then she said that McCann would come to speak at the synagogue and that she'd come too. And, Heather said. Vivian shrugged her shoulders. That's it? Heather continued, wanting more. Is there a date? Is there a plan? Where did you leave things? I guess we'll have to wait and see. Viv, Heather said, resting her hand on Vivian's shoulder. I think you should be bold here. You like her, you've gotten some good vibes, just ask her out. I'll think about it, Vivian said, moving closer to the register as the line shortened. Come on, what would Moses do? Vivian looked at Heather blankly. Miriam? Heschel? Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Heather added, still no response. So that's not a thing for you guys. Nope, Vivian said. We have too much anxiety and too many opinions. Decisiveness doesn't really run through our veins. Heather rolled her eyes at Vivian. They each ordered a bag of popcorn topped with a drizzle of butter. As they made their way to the correct theater, passing posters from upcoming releases and scrolling through their emails for just another minute, Heather halted. Vivian stopped and looked behind her when she noticed Heather not matching her pace. Do you have Carla's number? Heather asked. I got it when I met her. Why don't you just call her right now? I'm here to support you, to pump you up. I cannot do that, Heather. Yes, you can. You do hard things all the time, Viv. Vivian stood in silence, hunched over her phone, avoiding Heather's gaze. Heather suddenly reached over and stripped Vivian's phone from her, navigating right to her contacts. What are you doing? Vivian asked. I'm doing you a favor. Vivian tried to get the phone back, but Heather kept her at a distance with one hand while continuing to search with the other. Carla Dixon, aha. Heather immediately pressed the call button. She handed the phone back to Vivian, who let out a sharp shriek and pressed the red hang up icon. Well, now what's she gonna think? Heather said, looking very pleased with herself. I can't believe you did that, Vivian said, looking around the theater hallway to see if anyone was watching them. You might as well try again since the call registered on her phone, Heather said. Vivian let out a deep breath. Ugh, fine. Breathing heavily, she walked over to an empty corner and finally pressed the call button. Heather followed. It rang once, then twice. Vivian was hoping with all her being Carla would not pick up. Hello, she heard on the other side of the line. Oh, hi, it's Vivian Green, Rabbi Vivian. She slapped her head against her head. Rabbi Vivian? Oh, hi. I know you're pretty busy and that I'll be calling Jeff, the scheduler, for a time for Mike to come to the synagogue. But in the meantime, I was hoping we could meet up. I'd love to learn more about the political landscape here. And well, after running into you today, I realized you were the right person. Vivian's whole body was tight. Let me look at my schedule, Carla said. There was a long silence over the phone. Vivian turned her body away from Heather. Presumably, Carla was looking through her schedule on her phone, but all Vivian could think was that she was wondering why this weirdo rabbi had called. I'm booked solid until 9 for the next 3 weeks, Carla said, but we could get a drink after 9 sometime. That works for me, Vivian said, even though she preferred to be in bed by 10:30. How about Ruby's? The kitchen sink is more my speed, Carla said. Plus, they sometimes give me free beer there. Vivian wondered what about Carla's life led her to receive free beer. Okay, how about Wednesday, Vivian asked. All right, Wednesday it is. See you then. Vivian hung up, turned around, and glared furiously at Heather, who had heard the whole conversation. Looks like you just set yourself up another night meeting. Hey, Vivian said, holding her stare, given the situation you put me in, I think I should get points for recovering. Fine, I'll give you a few points, Heather said, pumping her fist in the air. You've got a date. Oh my God, Vivian said, letting it sink in. But do you think she thinks it's a date? I don't know how you gays work, Heather said, as she put her arm around Vivian's shoulders and guided her into the theater. That makes 2 of us.
That's so great. And I love that, I agree that, as someone who also has a lot of rabbi friends and relatives, the realness of it, and that these rabbis are people who go out for brunch and to the movies and who date and have insecurities, feels really important. And I also love that she finds support and camaraderie and close friendship with other female clergy from other religions. Because I think there's often an assumption that rabbis just are in a Jewish setting all the time and that they don't know anybody who isn't Jewish. And so the fact that actually she finds support from women who are in a similar public kind of role, but who come from different backgrounds, I thought was really, really interesting.
Yeah, thanks.
And also there's a scene where she calls one of her mentors, who is an older woman rabbi. And I love that too, because I also felt like that really speaks to this moment where we have enough, like there have been women in the rabbinate long enough that there can be multiple generations of female rabbis who can, the young women who are rabbis now, like Rabbi Vivian, they have role models who were also women who are rabbis. And I think that's a really important shift that's happened. They're not all pioneers entirely.
Yeah. Yeah, well, something that I'm just thinking about in terms of what you said before about how Rabbi Vivian is this person who has relationships outside of the Jewish community. A big part of the book and the plot line is sort of how Rabbi Vivian and how the synagogue, Beth Abraham, that she works at, are really navigating all of these different dynamics, like in their own community and in their world. And that's something that really like draws her to this community. It takes place in Providence. It's an urban Jewish community. It's a smaller shul than some of the other larger bureaucratic ones, although certainly there's still bureaucratic shtuyot to mishugas to work through, but it felt really important to share this as a story that really paints this synagogue and this rabbi as not existing within a Jewish vacuum, but really being a part of this broader city, this broader community, because no synagogue, no rabbi stands alone, no community stands alone. We're all always interacting with our place, with our broader community, whether we acknowledge it or not.
And I thought that was a really interesting shift that you made from the original Rabbi Small stories, which take place, as you mentioned, in a kind of make-believe town, small town, and you chose to set the story in a real city. So not just in a city, but in a city that actually exists, which you presumably had to like do some research about, so what was your thinking around making that shift, and how did you go about kind of learning about the setting so that you could place it accurately?
Yeah, well, I knew I wanted it to be in a real city. I mean, a lot of people who write fiction, certainly Harry Kemmelman and others, will, do some world building or just like create something that's similar to an existing place but is different. And I think as a first-time fiction writer, it was much easier to like grasp onto a real place. But also I just wanted this to read as familiar and real and relatable. And I live in Boston, in the Boston area, so do you. It would have been way too close to try to write this in Boston. I knew
would have
right
had to
away
write about your colleagues probably, so that would be off the table. Yeah.
No go, definitely not a good idea. And I had spent a tiny bit of time in Providence, and I realized that Providence sort of offered this possibility of like similar like New England feel, but definitely like smaller. And the Jewish community in Providence is really like in the city, is in Providence proper. And so it made some of the storylines. There's a storyline about a vacant piece of land that Beth Abraham owns, and sort of different visions within the synagogue that different power players have of what to do with that land. And Rabbi Vivian really wants it to be used for the purposes of serving the broader Providence community at a time when there's, when real estate prices are going up, when gentrification is real. And so that's definitely one piece that really like reflects that. I think another piece is that there's this relationship that comes about, that we learn about, that Vivian has with the custodian of the shul, Raymond Weeks, and he is Black. He's one of the few Black people who are sort of like present in this community in some form. We get to know his son, Mac, who's involved in various kinds of activism within the city. And so we learn about how different groups in Providence are relating to police. And the mystery in this book is that the synagogue catches on fire. And so of course, there are going to be some questions that come up about how does this community secure itself? What happens in the face of this kind of like violence and violation, and what choices are made. And I wanted all of these questions about what choices the synagogue makes, what choices different people within the synagogue makes, to really be within a context where other people's like the outcomes of those decisions mattered to other people, and not everybody was going to have like the same, and each outcome would not affect each group in the same way. And so it was important to me for this to feel like a real exploration of what are Jewish communities, and sometimes urban Jewish communities, but I think all of us, what are the questions, what are the challenges that we're all dealing with, what are the choices that we're all trying to make right now.
Yeah, and you managed to fit a lot of different issues in there. There's, as you mentioned, real estate and, land use, affordable housing, gentrification, there's police brutality, there's a mayoral election, there's anti-Semitism. How did you kind of figure out what issues you could tackle and fit in there? And were what kind of choices did you have to make in terms of what you were able to address?
Yeah. I wrote this book over the course of like 3 years. I had sort of like finished a first draft in 1 year, then sort of like took a pause, got some feedback. And each time I finished a draft, the next time that I would like go to edit, something would happen in the world that really shifted how I was thinking about a particular storyline. So for instance, I knew that if there was going to be a fire in this shul, that it's very obvious that one possible endpoint is that it was an act of anti-Semitic violence. And in the beginning, I started writing this in 2017. I was like, yeah, sure. Like, that's clearly like one option, but like, that's not that serious. Like, that's just something people sort of like go to, but it's like not actually what's going to happen. And in between the two drafts, the first and second draft, the Tree of Life shooting happened in Pittsburgh. And I was like, I need to process this for myself. I need to take these threats more seriously. There is like real violence that is being enacted. It is very intense. It is very intense to like be the leadership of a synagogue in a moment like this. And so there were ways in which some of the storylines that were actually just like more in the background, I like turned up a bit because of what was happening like in our world. And so there were certain pieces that started out, I had done some work on affordable housing, and I was like, I want that to be part of the storyline because I think the way the synagogue would use its land would be really interesting in exploring some of these issues. But that piece, definitely the anti-Semitism exploration, I think was really shifting over time. I also think the story around police brutality really shifted over time in a lot of ways. I was about to be done with this book on like in January of 2020. And then my editor, there were just like all of these COVID complications. And so the process like really dragged out. And in the end, it made it possible to actually explore some of my own sort of like ideas and challenges and like fears and questions around police brutality against Black folks and reckoning with the racial uprising that happened last summer. And so I think in a lot of ways, like things just appeared in this book that were happening in our world. Like it didn't take much imagination to really figure out like, what would be a good background storyline here? It's like, what are the background storylines? What's happening right now? Like, what are the ways that rabbis, that people in our Jewish communities, that are allies, that are friends, that are custodians, that are Christian clergy, like what are we all dealing with and how are we engaging with those issues differently? And what can we learn by putting all of those pieces together into one story?
It would seem to me like the hardest part would be just finishing, because it would be so easy to keep responding. You know, it was so clear that the world was speaking and interacting with, you know, how you were framing the story, and that it would be hard to wrap that up because it is such an ongoing thing. But I guess that's why it's good that this is going to be a series, because you'll have opportunities to to continue that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was also really nice about the way that you addressed all of these issues that are so live in Jewish communities today is that, you know, except for maybe one character who's sort of villainous, all the characters pretty much have good intentions, and yet they often miss the mark. And all of them, including Rabbi Vivian, like have things that they misunderstand or that they overstep or overreact, or, you know, just respond in a way that you're like, or they might realize it or the reader realizes it. And so you're able to complicate it really, and to not just make it like they're the good guys and the bad guys, but you can see how even the people who end up sort of being on the wrong side in some way are really acting out of what they think is best for the community. They're not racist or not explicitly racist. They're just responding in ways that are habitual or that they think are going to be best for their community. And so there's a lot of room to kind of explore. And I think hopefully, I certainly felt this way, for readers to recognize different parts of their own experience or their own encounters that they've had in the story.
Yeah, I mean, you really nailed it. And I think that really speaks to how much I was really like processing and like reckoning with my own sort of questions about some of these moments where we miss the mark. Like I've definitely done that. I've been in you know, meetings where people sort of like say the wrong thing. And so I think in a lot of ways, like this is an invitation to get to like see ourselves in different characters, because I mean, I think many people who read this book, many people who have read this book have told me like they really, there's such a familiarity of this world in the book, and there are characters who they're like that, they're like elements of that's totally me, or that's totally like my rabbi, or that's totally like my shul president, or that's my ritual committee chair, or whatever it might be. And so I think like really inviting like myself as a writer dealing with all of this, and readers to just sort of see themselves like in some of these characters and in some of the foibles as we like navigate really, really rocky terrain is something that I hope comes out of this book, and that feels like an invitation. And I also think your point about there, you know, most people have good intentions in this book. And I really tried to have like empathy for mostly everybody in the book, because we're all really like dealing with just some hard questions.
I think also one of the pieces that came out really strongly, and I don't know the Rabbi small books well enough to know whether this theme kind of carries across, but I was struck by how much generational differences and relationships was a big theme here, both between Rabbi Vivian and her senior rabbi, Rabbi Joseph, and so many of the congregants that she's interacting with, and also between Raymond and his son Mac, who have kind of different approaches to how to pursue, issues of racial justice. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about kind of how you approach that theme and why that became such an important thread throughout the book.
I there was when I initially started writing the book, there was this huge storyline that I actually ended up cutting out in the end, and it was that Rabbi Vivian was sort of like in this synagogue and like doing her like day job, but like it's clear like is that the community she would join if like she weren't the rabbi? And so I wanted to create some sort of context where we would get to see as the reader, like, what is she aiming for? If it's not like, if she's like trying to push this community, that's great. But like, what does she actually want? And so I created this group of like young people in Providence, some of whom were Jewish, some of whom were like curious about Judaism or Jewish adjacent, who ended up like studying Torah together in a bar. And that was like this experience of like, well, at least this is like the thing that could nourish her and give her like some sort of vision of like what she was working towards. And at a certain point, I realized that like that was not an important part of this story, that this story was really about this synagogue, was about like the relationships between all of these different people, because like it is real life to have to like be in these intergenerational contexts, these intergenerational communities and relationships, and that's like significant. Like, Vivian couldn't like be a part of this little group and lead this group in Torah study and at the same time like create useful like infrastructure and resources for the people of Providence. That could only happen through being a part of like an actual institution where there were people of different ages, and where she could sort of play this role of bringing some fresh perspective. And so it felt really clear to me as I was like trying to work on that story, that the story is really about like, how are we building community where like there are a lot of different perspectives, different opinions, different generational approaches to what a shul is, to what activism looks like, what it's okay for our members to do. That like those are important things to explore. We don't all actually have to be in the same place. And I think with Raymond and Mac, I mean, that is very much less my experience, but it felt important as I've sort of seen and been a part of different kinds of efforts for racial justice, that there are actually like very different perspectives and community efforts to address the same kind of problems. But the hope here was that there were like some moments where people could really like come together and support each other as family, as people who are in community together, because there are going to be those differences, but there also are definitely like things we can do together that's shared.
I'd love for you to talk also a little bit. I mean, I think part of what comes out particularly in some of the intergenerational pieces, but throughout, is just the amount of misogyny that Rabbi Vivian is dealing with on a daily basis. Which as a woman who knows a lot of female rabbis and is a person who works in the public, like much of that was familiar to me, but I think could be really revelatory to a lot of people reading this book who might be like, wow, I had no idea that women get asked those things or people do those things to them. So can you talk a little bit about how you kind of approach that theme and what went into crafting that part of Rabbi Vivian's experience?
I think that that I know, like a lot of the stories, a lot of the dialogue came out of life, came out of stories that either like I experienced or that other people experienced. I think that there's this thing that happens a few times where Joseph, who's the senior rabbi, and Vivian, who's the associate rabbi, are in the same room with like various leaders, tend to be male leaders, and that the leader of the synagogue will say rabbi, and it will just be obvious that like they're not talking to Vivian, they're talking to Joseph, that like when they say rabbi, that's who they're talking about. There's also like we Heather Wu, who we were introduced to in the reading. The first thing we learn about her when she's at brunch with the other clergy friend Lisa and Vivian is that she's pregnant, and that like one of her congregants just like has made a lot of jokes about her being pregnant and how like problematic that is. And so they're just like, there are all these sort of little moments that, you know, microaggressions, one might say, these pokes that happen that are real. And when you start to like see them build up over time, it really does paint this broader picture of misogyny. And I think another piece that I was like really interested in is that, you know, a lot of characters, especially like congregants, are sort of like dealing with like these questions about like the mayoral election and who to support, or like security, and like how in the face of like rising anti-Semitism and a fire, like how are we going to do this thing, like how are we going to protect ourselves, and you know, the role of a rabbi like is often very pastoral. It's like, I need to affirm your fears, I need to be able to offer you the support that you need right now. And one thing I like was interested in doing is like, what happens when a congregant's pastoral needs sort of are like in conflict with what Vivian thinks is right. And I think she has really good pastoral skills. And I think she knows sometimes she's like developing some instincts, you know, sometimes pushes a little bit too hard, but is developing some instincts around like how to push people like outside of their comfort zone, and not just always affirm. And I think especially, you know, female rabbis who are, you know, have not been brought up as male in our community, that like those pastoral skills are often seen as like such the strength and like the, you know, one of the major tools in the toolbox. And so I was really interested in like complicating that a little bit and trying to really show like a bit of a sharper edge to this rabbi who I think like does have those skills and is learning them, but is also figuring out like where that line is.
Right. And also that I mean, I think part of what you're able to do, because as we already talked about, you know, you present her as like a full human, is you realize that like her congregants have pastoral needs and she does too, right? And so how do you minister, I guess is the right word, to people when you yourself are also needy? And, you know, it's so relevant in this moment of the pandemic where you have lots of leaders who are trying to take care of their congregations, and they're living through the same difficult circumstances and feeling just as exhausted and stressed and lost and anxious. And I think actually, you know, one of the things that women in the rabbinate have done is pull back the curtain a little bit on what it means to be a human being in these roles, because it was a new role, and there wasn't, you know, this kind of, because women were not yet already on the kind of high up on the bima the way that male rabbis were, where they were seen as sort of untouchable. It was an opportunity for women to also talk about like what are the real challenges that men, of course, also experienced, but didn't necessarily have the I don't know what the right word is, permission or skills or whatever to kind of speak honestly about, like things like, you know, work-life balance or parenting and the rabbinate. It's not that men don't have those same needs and issues. It's just that it wasn't part of the kind of traditional view of what a rabbi was. And when you change out what that traditional view is, it also opens the possibility for addressing those issues in different ways. Sometimes the way those issues come up is like, you know, boundary crossing and uncomfortable and filled with microaggressions, but also creates an opportunity for different kinds of conversations that I think are actually like growth opportunities for anybody in those roles, because having women on the bima has enabled men on the bima to also be different in that space, and try out different kinds of approaches, and maybe acknowledge their humanity in different kinds of ways too, I think.
Yeah.
What has the response to the book been? I mean, do you have a sense of who your readers are? And I know someone asked a question earlier about, are non-Jews reading this book, and what are they getting from it? I'd love to hear a little bit about what the response has been.
Yeah, so I feel like I've gotten a bunch of different responses. I think young Jewish queer progressive people have really loved this. I also feel like a lot of those are my own people, and so I that's definitely like a segment, a demographic that this has reached, and definitely a group of people who have said, "Wow, like this feels so familiar," and it feels like we're really like dealing with a lot of the questions of the moment, and we're really appreciative of that. I work as a synagogue organizer, and so like and have been in the Boston area for almost a decade, and a lot of the people from the synagogues that I have worked with have given me some feedback and said that they have like really loved the book, and also loved the sort of like homage to Harry Kemmelman and to the original David Small books. My favorite comment that someone in that segment told me was, it was like an older woman who was like, I really love this book, and I loved the Kemmelman books. One thing I feel like I really learned was like how lesbians date, which is something I like didn't know. So it's cool to see how some of the different demographics will be paying attention to different pieces and be like, I feel like I really learned something over here, where other people are like, oh yeah, like ambiguous dates among like two women where you're like, I don't know what this is right now. Like, I get that. That's my life. That happened to me yesterday. So I feel like those are two groups, because I know a lot of folks like in those demographics who have reached out, but I also think it is probably reflective of like, people in synagogues in like Philadelphia, where my family lives, and in other parts of the country. And in terms of people who are not Jewish reading this book, I know some clergy, a bunch of like Unitarian Universalist clergy in particular, who were like, wow, like this really speaks to my experience too. And I think that there's definitely like some niche references in this book, but I think that hopefully the explorations of racism in the community, of like the role of police in the community, the role of like resources of more wealthy communities potentially being available to the broader city, and broader demographics beyond just who goes to that synagogue. Those felt like the kinds of topics and subject matter and questions that I think would be of interest to a broader group. So my sense is like, it's a lot of people in some of these concentric circles that I've mentioned, but I've also heard from people with less familiarity that it is like, it's interesting, and there are some pieces they can hold on to.
I could even imagine it being used as a sort of organizing tool, because it would be easier for people to talk about the dilemmas that are in the book than the ones that are the exact ones that they're facing in their communities, although I'm sure they're very similar in some ways.
Yeah.
We've gotten a lot of questions about whether this is going to be a series. So tell us a little bit about your plans going forward.
Yeah, I've been working on a second book, and so I would say that the first book, like the sort of underlying question that I was really thinking about is, who makes up our community, and what choices do we make to reflect that and to prioritize whoever we choose. And the second book, I've been really grappling with this question of where's our home, and it's going to take place a few years in the future. There's going to be a big storyline around climate change and a storm that is sort of wreaking havoc on the city. There are also some robots involved. Some like possibilities of some people trying to get the robots to go settle Mars. It's a bit experimental. once you try fiction writing, all of these worlds open up. And so I'm really excited about it. And I've also been working on some short stories to try to work on some different characters who aren't just Rabbi Vivian and all of her friends and congregants.
What is your research and writing process like?
I mostly at the beginning, I just try to get a story out there. I start in my head with a few scenes, write those scenes, and then I kind of like fill in, oh, like this probably happened before, this probably happened after. Like what was this person then experiencing? So now I'll write a chapter from this person's point of view. So it's very iterative. I definitely don't like map everything out and have the whole thing before me to like then just sort of type out. Like as I find typing to be like, it sort of like has its own momentum and its own like creative power. And so as I write one thing, like the scenes just sort of like unravel themselves. And like for the book I'm reading now, I don't know anything about robots, but I've written a first draft that talks a lot about robots who are being trained to make moral decisions. So I've written a lot about that and definitely now need to like do real research to like back up what I've sort of put out there. There's also a lot about like climate adaptation in the city of Providence. So I've been doing some research about like what's happening in the city of Providence and in other places around like adaptation strategies. And so a lot of it is like, let's start with the story. And I know I'm writing about some things that I really don't yet know about, but I'll fill that in the second and third draft. Like one thing in this book that I did a bunch of research on in the first book was like, how can you tell when like a fire is arson, and like what are some ways of like committing arson? And so I was really worried that like somebody would catch my Google searches and come and get me because I feel like I asked some really weird questions. But yeah, I did research on like checklists for inspections of buildings to like, pass the city codes and all of that. So mostly it's just like getting the story out there, then like, what don't I really know about that I'm sort of writing about, and then go and research it.
Those pieces sound like they may take, you talked at the beginning about writing as a sort of spiritual practice, and I could see how some of those rabbit holes, while very interesting and great opportunities for kind of, self-directed learning, might take you a little bit away from the spiritual practice element of it.
Yeah, that's true. But I think the first stage of like getting the story was very much the spiritual practice, and then the rest is like, well, now I guess this is what writing is, and I want to see this come to fruition. So I'll keep on trucking forward.
We have a couple questions in the chat. Did you consider any alternative endings to this novel, or was it clear from the very beginning sort of where you were going to arrive?
I think in the primary mystery of the book, I was pretty clear where I wanted to arrive, but definitely added some different like pathways and red herrings and possibilities along the way, in terms of like how the fire was started and who was responsible. I will say that there was one piece that really changed, which is that, and I don't think this is like a spoiler, but the storyline around Mac being like an activist around police brutality in the city of Providence. So there's this like sort of culminating scene that happens in the book, where Mac and his like comrades are testifying at a city budget hearing around the budget and advocating for some of the money that was going to police being reallocated to other kinds of city services and resources that really invest in the lives of Black residents. And that scene was initially completely different. And that was really because of the changes that I was experiencing, that I was sort of seeing around me, that had sort of come about through this racial uprising last summer. And the original scene was actually that Vivian ends up like being Vivian and Joseph end up being at that city council hearing. But the original scene was actually that Mac and his team were meeting directly with the police chief, and that they were advocating for more representation on like an advisory council that would oversee the police, which is very important and needed. But there was something about what had come out of that meeting feeling so small and so not what we needed at the moment, and not what they would fight for at that moment, and not what would be a bigger ask for Joseph and Vivian and others to really show up for and be in solidarity with. That was one piece that really changed over time. And so I think, yeah, just going back to like, this was all happening I was writing this at a time when so many things were changing. And so there were pieces where the resolution or the last piece of it really shifted just because of what was happening around me. But I was really clear about the fire from the beginning.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about all the conversation about defunding the police, and then there that appears, and you explicate that very well, so it's clear what that means. Like, I think it's a good, there's lots of good learning opportunities here for people who might, catch certain things from the news, but not always understand what the application might be or look like. There was also a question about, you talked a little bit about response to the book, but you didn't mention what rabbis have said about it. And, have you gotten particular feedback from rabbis who might identify either with Rabbi Vivian or with Rabbi Joseph?
I've gotten a lot of feedback from the Vivians, not so much from the Josephs, and I'm like really open to it. I'm here for it, whatever people want to share. But yeah, I mean, I think rabbis really found the ones that I know and that are like reaching out to me. There are probably others that haven't reached out, have just like found this like almost like too familiar. Like it's like this is so much my world, and I'm like, it's cool to see it in a book, but also like it's hard to like sit through a scene of a board meeting that is so hard and uncomfortable. And I've sat through that board meeting. It's so hard. So yeah, I think I've appreciated some of the feedback from the Vivians, and I'll get back to you about the Josephs if this gets there.
I particularly loved a lot of the older women who are part of the congregation who Vivian kind of cultivates relationships with and pushes a little bit, and I'm excited to see some of those characters continue and grow in different ways. They don't usually get enough attention and credit for the work that they do behind the scenes.
They come back, and there's going to be a new shul president in the next scene who we've already met, so stay tuned.
Awesome. This is a little bit of a shift, but I know that you also host a podcast on basketball. And first of all, I hope you know that women's basketball was founded by a Jewish woman, Senda Berenson, and we have information about her on our site. We can share that link. But tell us a little bit about your podcast and this particular project of yours.
So my twin sister, Tali, and I have recently embarked on this podcast, which is really, it's called Who We Can Believe In, the progressive case for the WNBA. And it's really like a result of us coming to really like love the WNBA, the Women's Professional Basketball League, over the past like 6 or so months. And we proselytize about it to everybody. We grew up as very, very devout Philadelphia sports fans, but of course this was all for men's professional sports. We were predominantly like humongous Philadelphia Eagles fans. Also the Philadelphia 76ers, Eagles are football, Sixers are basketball. And like, this was a big part of our life. We also played basketball, and we're like feminists and like activists, and the WNBA has like consistently, the players have always been at the forefront of athlete activism, specifically around like racial justice, around queerness, around trans, like inclusion of trans athletes. And so we really were like, this is ridiculous that we have not caught on to this until now. And so we've been like doing a deep dive and like learning about all of the teams, but also doing some research on like what sort of happened over the past 25 years. Like, how did we miss this What are the sort of factors at play that have made it harder for us to access this, and why is now the moment to really start following the WNBA? And it's a really exciting time for all kinds of reasons. You can learn more about it on the podcast, but it's been really fun to not just, like annoy my wife with all of my love for the WNBA, but actually like share it with other people and get to invite other people into our joy. And the goal is that it's like really joyful and offers like a generous invitation in.
Great. Well, I'm going to have to listen to that because I don't really know anything about basketball. Parts of my family watch a lot of sports, but my son is a hockey player, so I get sucked into hockey against my will mostly. But I'm excited to learn more about women's basketball. So thank you for giving us that entree. And I'm imagining like the Rabbi Vivians of the WNBA, and where these stories could cross.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it.
Right.
I'll let you know what happens.
I mean, I definitely think Rabbi Vivian could join a women's hockey league. I just want to put that out there.
A part of me feels like Carla might be the basketball player.
Yes, I was going to say she could date a basketball player also, but I didn't want to kick Carla out of the picture. But I wasn't picturing Carla as being that tall, though. So.
Well, yeah. My wife is 5'11", and I picture Carla as my wife. So I just imagine she's good at basketball.
Nice. And we have a suggestion for roller derby, which also could be great.
Roller derby is a phenomenal idea. I love that so much.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing this story with us and for helping us delve into the current challenges and debates of Jewish communal life. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this conversation. Given the subject of this book, I thought you might want to learn more, all of you, about women in the rabbinate and how they've transformed not just the rabbinate, but Judaism and the Jewish community. And so you can check out JWA's collection on women rabbis, which features interviews with 75 female rabbis and also explores themes that are related to their leadership and more. And while you're there, I hope you will explore further on jwa.org. We have so much material there to discover and help you gain insight about the diversity of the Jewish story. As I said at the beginning, this is our last QBT for a few weeks. We're taking a break for the end of summer and the Jewish holidays, but we will be back. And in the meantime, it's a good time to catch up on any sessions that you may have missed. And you can find all of our recordings of past QBTs on our website. So I encourage you to check those out. And of course, stay tuned for more information on our fall QBT series, which will start in October. Also, hopefully you have all seen the save the date for JWA's 25th anniversary event. I saw Linda Wimmer put something in the chat about our 25th anniversary. We're going to be having a virtual event on Thursday, November 4th at our usual time of 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So we very much hope that all of you will celebrate with us then, and stay tuned for more information about that too. And thank you all for joining us tonight. It's wonderful to be with you again. And until next time, wishing you a very good end of the summer and a sweet and healthy new year. Thank you all.